A lot of tutors and instructors are concerned about lesson planning. How do I go about deciding what I'm going to do with my student, with my learners? So Candy is an instructor. She meets a lot one-on-one with students and teaches a group, and I also have a group that I meet with. And so we were just going to have a little conversation about lesson planning to give you some ideas, tell you things we've learned in the process of planning a lesson. So Candy, how do you start planning a lesson?
When I first get a student, I have some conversation with them to find out exactly where they are in their skills. And I'll have them try to read something. I'll see how much of my talk they understand. And then I try and determine, what level to start and what skills are the weakest and the strongest, and then go from there. I look what textbooks we have available. Sometimes I have to create something like, if my students are having trouble with vowel sounds, I'll create vowel exercises where the letters in the words are all the same except for the vowel, and then have them pronounce the different words so that they recognize that the change in sound changes the meaning. But most of the time I'll take my cue from a textbook and go from there, use the textbook as the skeleton for lesson planning.
Yeah, I kind of do the same thing. I try to think about what the students' goals are, what they're, and tailor my objectives for the lesson to that. And my students, most of them they speak English fairly well, but they aren't comfortable reading and writing. And so that's where I focus on reading and writing exercises with my students as much as possible. To keep it relevant for them, that's what they're coming for. And so that's kind of my starting place. And even though we often will have conversations and they'll often get a lot of listening practice as well, to mix it up and provide variety in the lesson, it's still good to focus on the reading and the writing. What do you do at the beginning of class? How do you start a class?
Well, my students stagger in. I have one that comes early usually, and I will go ahead and start working with her on phonics or have her read to me. She reads very well, but she's frustrated with her ability to write. And so we're working with spelling textbook so that she can write words by sound. And then as other students come in, I will give her something to work on and then move to someone else and work with them. Because in my beginning class, the students are all at completely different levels from each other. So they're getting primarily one-on-one time rather than the whole class working together, because there's such a difference. I have students that are almost intermediate level to students who don't speak, read, write, or listen very well. And then as they come in, I just give them something to work on and go to the next person. There's some that are close enough where they can work together, and they naturally gravitate towards groups and help each other out. So they get a little extra time that way.
Yeah, in my class, I find that that you have to be flexible. You don't know who's going to show up any particular day, or when they're going to arrive. So it's nice to have a variety of things that you've planned in advance, kind of as backups in case somebody doesn't show, or it's hard to predict sometimes how long something will take, and sometimes I'm surprised at how quickly it goes, and I'm glad I have another worksheet or another thing that's still useful, that I have on the back burner that I can use if I need it, or just leave it for another time if not. For me, one thing I like to do at the first class, especially as a warm-up, especially the first time I've ever met some students, is to start with something fun, like an icebreaker type of activity. But since I don't know the students as well, that I try to pick something that is kind of levels the playing field, so that somebody doesn't have an advantage really if they speak more English. And so one thing I've used is like a memory game where I collect a bunch of objects around my house, keys, knife, spoon, fork, pen, driver's license, different things. I get about 20 different objects, put them on a table, and then cover them up with a sheet of cloth. And then when people come into the class, I uncover it for a minute or two and let everybody look at it. And then I cover it up again, and then I ask them to list all the things that they could remember. And even those that don't know the name of something, they can describe what it is, and it's just a fun thing. You don't really need English in order to remember what you see.
Mm-hmm.
Or games like where you have two photos where there are changes in one, and so spotting the differences between the two photos, that's another game that even people who don't speak any English, they can still find the differences and point them out, and it's a good way to, you know, they still get practice trying to describe what they're seeing, and it's a good group activity, but nobody has an advantage, and it's a good way to start. But I don't do that every time, usually just the first class or every once in a while for fun. Most of the time, the beginning of class, I try to review a little bit from what they did before, which in your class would be hard to do when everybody's kind of doing their own thing independently. But either way, you got to be flexible, right?
Yeah, I use the chalkboard a lot for illustration, and I usually try and find examples where they could get tripped up. For example, one of my students was coming across the word sue, as in lawsuit, and they've seen the word sue as a name. So I went up to the chalkboard and I did it with a capital and then with a lowercase s, and I said, "This is a woman's name. This is," we figured out what the word was in their native language, and I said, "This means, you know, sue." And then I showed them suit as in a man's suit for wear, and lawsuit. And the difference between verb and noun, and how, you know, the words are spelled the same, but you have to look at all the words around them to see what it really means.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's good to use the board. I often try to have my students write on the board as much as possible. Once they're comfortable with each other, it's not as embarrassing then to write, but just to practice writing in front of the group. And they often will all help each other anyway, and that's really good practice. Everybody's paying attention, and they take turns, so everybody gets to be on the spot, and it kind of builds some rapport, and it gets to be a nice environment, but they're getting the practice writing as well as reading. I think variety is the best way to spice